All right, so we're going to talk a little bit more about social contagion. I'm going to throw up some more fun examples for you about success and that sort of thing, why things take off. We have 3 lectures left, so there's going to be some compression of things that I want to talk about. I want to talk about scaling a little bit on Friday. On Thursday, that will go in. I'll probably talk a little bit more about that on the following, in the last lecture, and then we'll have this kind of summing up, a complexification story, all right? And we have a little game today, so we'll do that. Game, food-based game. That's good. Maybe, if you're a winner. Winning is not for everyone, although you could be very nice to your friends if you win. No. I mean, as I've said, there are lots of different. Yeah, that's okay.
Is there a propensity to try and force a power law type of thing or complex or stuff that isn't?
Sure. Oh yeah. People get excited about whatever it is the big flavor, and power laws have been one for sure. Yeah, they'll find them. And I've tried to show some bad examples, right? I mean, there's that where it's something else, or the scaling is over 1 order of magnitude, and it's about, sure, absolutely. Yeah. The big story is moving away from this very universal thing of the normal distribution, which you could posit was sort of everywhere. And it is. I mean, it's really a ubiquitous. But then power law size distributions, and we'll look at different kinds of, like scaling is a different power law relationship, right? There are many stories that can give rise to these power law size distributions. That's the big change. And there are some that are more, like the rich gets richer one is one of the big stories, right? So there is some distribution of stories out there that give rise to these things, these distributions that we see over and over again, and they matter because they're full of surprise and badness. Well, it's pretty strong. Yeah, it's pretty strong. So the thing you could explore is adding other mechanisms and degrading the mechanism and so on. So if you put cost in there, so there's a limit to how many links you can handle, then you get power laws with cutoffs, right? So that is a sensible kind of deviation from that, right? So it doesn't keep growing out, which makes complete sense. I mean, that you see that kind of scaling all the time. Occasionally you see mathematicians will pop up, or someone who's very mathematically minded, and they'll say, this isn't a fractal because it doesn't scale forever. And you're like, what are you talking? Like, welcome to reality, human. I mean, you're allowed to have them in your head, but the world is full of things that have some cutoff at one end and the other end, and because of atoms and because of the size of the Earth or whatever it is, galaxies or something, like there's some scale, right? So, yeah. So I mean, that's one way, but there are other ways to, change or pervert or, adulterate the mechanism that would end up with other things. Whether it ends up in a completely different, like how fickle that is, that it ends up in a very different basket. I mean, one thing we saw is if you deviate from linear attachment, which is a very sensible kind of explanation for why it can happen, and we do see it in real phenomena, like the Linux kernel example. If it goes superlinear or sublinear, then you do get different behavior, yeah. The question is, how hard is it to move out into those, like how many systems actually have those things? Mathematically, we can explore them. And, we're not exploring every attachment kernel because there's sort of limits to what seems reasonable anyway. Yeah, but there's a lot of work more in describing to see how many fit into your particular joyous model of the world. Is that okay? Yeah. All right, we can talk more about that because that's a, yeah. I mean, ongoing discussion, but yeah. I just wanted to point out there are a couple, I gave these examples of things that take off, and like the Mona Lisa, for example. There are a couple of other slides I wanted to add. So this is this is just one story that appeared last year when Lance Armstrong's story explodes, right? He goes from hero. I mean, if you look at the frame around him, there's always this kind of doper frame that's sitting there, and now it's a winning frame, right? So it gets tanked. But this story in the Times was trying to say, well, right? That's the the heading is it was pivotal, right? So there was this one person from which everything took off from. So this gives you this sense that he would never have been caught unless this kind of one guy who did a bit of doping, raced with him a little bit, became, outed himself, I guess. Sparked a series of events. I mean, it's exactly the framing is exactly the same. Okay, so we showed you this one. So we had this story about editors. I wanted to show you this. This is a piece that I came across. It appeared in December. No. It must be December. Let me check that out. Anyway, it's at the start of this year, end of last year. So Maurice Sendak, Where the Wild Things Are, and various other pieces. He's an amusing character. He passed away this year. And this is just to connect into the books, right? So we had the thing about which books take off and so on. So did the success of Where the Wild Things Are ever feel like an albatross? Because he did a lot of other things and he cared a lot about a lot of his work. It's a nice book. It's perfectly nice. I can't complain about it. I'd love to be able to do his voice. I can't really. I remember Melville said, when I die, no one is going to mention Moby Dick. They're all going to talk about my first book about maidens in Tahiti. He was right. No mention of Moby Dick then. Everyone wanted another Tahitian book, a beach book, but then he kept writing deeper and deeper, and then came Moby Dick, and people hated it, right? The only ones who liked it were Mr. and Mrs. Nathaniel Hawthorne, and it didn't become famous till 1930. So another one of these stories, where we don't decide that it's famous until some other point, when then it's obviously famous. I think a difficult book to read. Who's made it through Moby Dick in an honest effort? Yeah. Lots of just 3-page descriptions of vestibules and things. Yeah, right. Yeah. It's an ornate book. I mean, it starts off with some brevity. Call me Ishmael. I think there's a Gary Larson cartoon with call me Bob, call me Jimmy, call me crossed out. Right. Okay. So Sendak's dog was Herman, named after Melville. Okay, nice little thing. So, and if you haven't seen these are there's a great interview with Colbert. Really, very, very, very good. Colbert is Colbert, and Sendak is Sendak. The quote he gets from Maurice Sendak is, "The sad thing is, I like it." He thinks it will be a success. It's about I'm a pole, like a flagpole, looking for its place in the world. Anyway, so Grimm fairy tales, the Colberti fairy tale. But it's a fun interview with him. Okay, so here's another aspect of success and so on. This guy, Tom Brady, right, did something last night, didn't work out, but has generally been considered to be quite a success, but was drafted here. This is New York Times has a lot of great data stuff now. That's way back, right? So this is the first draft pick. This is all the way down, and by some, I'll show you the site, but the idea is that using some measure of performance later on, like how many Pro Bowls and right, not money that they made, but other aspects. Let's get that guy. You can, yeah. So it's a nice little thing to play around with, right? So it's based on a number of starts, Pro Bowls, other factors. Compensation's not part of it, and so you can select the threshold, right? So this is the number one, at least, and this was at 2012 from each year. So this Gronkowski's, this is a pretty cool little, look at that. You can see how their rankings work. I'll show you a way of measuring, right? So if you have two orderings of something, you need a way of measuring how well they match up, right? So if one is kind of some measure of performance and the other one is what people thought beforehand, for example, you could have that. And if they're 1-to-1, right, then you want your measure to be, say, 1. And if they're completely askew, they're upside down, you want it to be 0. So you see the most extreme one is Brady down here. Peyton Manning, number 1, right? They were pretty accurate about that. But this is a big deal, and there are a lot of smart people, a lot of numbers get crunched. It's well defined. You're going to play a game of football. It's not going to be something else, right? So you'd think this might do very, very well, but it's pretty good. And so you can, it's a nice little graphic. So you can go up to 20, I think, if I can get there. Yeah, the top 20, you can see where they are. So they spread out. They spread out. Yeah. Okay, so that was a cool thing. All right. Prediction and success. Okay, so that's good news. And then I wanted to go on to the end of this. Okay, it's the end of this section. No, you don't want that. It's going to hurt. Okay, okay. All right, so we're going to talk just a little bit more about social contagion models, the oddness that comes out of them. We've gone from the mean field version, right, to the network version, where we start to see this story of having a large bunch of gullible, ugg-wearers, or incipient ugg-wearers, who are just, they're like, yeah, we'll do it, right? It was Crocs a few years ago. I mean, really, Crocs. And then we've moved out to networks, and we'll move it out to some slightly more complicated networks. These things are a little funny to look at, but the idea is to this is against this sort of the massive influential characters, right? Or this is looking at that, at least in terms of these models. So this is the simple random networks with threshold model contagion, and you've seen this kind of thing. So this is the average degree of the network, or influence if you like. So no one's connected here. There's not enough connection. Nothing spreads. Doesn't matter what your contagion mechanism is. And for threshold, once people are connected enough, they're not ignorant anymore, right? They see enough, so there's not enough of these vulnerable characters. Things don't take off, right? So that's what happens out here. These two curves are to show you what the average individual, if you start with them, what the final size is on average, two averages for the spread. And it's bimodal, right? Either it doesn't take off or it does. So there's a bit being sort of swept under the rug here. And these are the top 10%, which means the most connected people, right? So you think they're going to do better, and they do better. But one way to think about this is, okay, so here's the ratio of the degree of these people in the top 10% to the average ones, right? So they have, this is 1, so they are, obviously they have more friends, so that average has got to be above 1. The gain is typically, cascade size ratio is the other thing to look at, and that's the ratio of these two pieces. So when the thing is poorly connected, then these influential characters do better. But when it's in this kind of middle ground, then they both give rise to the same kind of size. So it's the ratio of these two things. These are pretty similar. And that big jump is really due to the fact that these things are getting close to 0, right? There's a lot of movement down here. But when these things are up, the average is pretty much, or the ratio is pretty much 1. So you can then talk, so there are a couple of ratios here. The last thing is gain. So it's the cascade size ratio divided by the degree ratio. So it's a ratio of two ratios. But the idea is, if you double the degree of your initial person, or you triple it, do you double or triple on average, the final size of your spread, right? Does it work like that? So if it's linear, then you kind of know you can just put in more money. If it's sublinear, then it's not doing as well as you want. If it's superlinear, then you just keep putting more money into the well-connected people. I mean, that would be the way to think about it. And so in all of these cases, the gain ratio is less than 1, except for this little patch here. But that's really at this extreme case where nothing's really taking off. There's some details that I'm, of course, covering over. This is a different kind of network. That was a pure kind of random Edish-Rennie network. This is a skewed one, not exactly preferential attachment, but skewed. So you see a change now, right? So the top 10% are now doing better. They're clearly doing better. You get this same kind of structure, though. These windows are opening up where it's better to use the more influential characters. It's worth your money to try and get to the top 10% rather than these average ones. I mean, the average people are more, in principle, influential. That's the idea. Okay, so I'll come back to some of those. I'll skip that one. That's okay. This is basically to show you that you can create triggering mechanisms. So, there's something useful about this. Okay, so you could start with this one. I imagine everyone has a third threshold. So here's something where one person could trigger. Now there are no vulnerables in here, right? Apart from this little initial group here. So these guys all have 4 connections. So they're not vulnerable, right? So 1 of 4 neighbors turns on, they don't turn on. But this is not a random network anymore. It's not locally purely branching. So immediately you start to, this is just made up, you can concoct networks that have a triggering structure in them, right? So I know Gleason's seen this sort of thing too. So it can spread through here because these two will light up next because 1 in 3, they see their one friend. They don't know each other, but then these double connections here mean 2 out of 4 and 2 out of 4. So they'll switch, they'll switch, they'll switch. So you can at least start to see that group structure and so on can really change the way these things behave. And that story about vulnerables is not a universal one, right? So again, it's this problem of moving out with toy models and getting the idea of things. This is another more complicated thing, but essentially you're taking a simple network, ramifying or replacing these little nodes by other nodes, connecting them in certain ways so that it would cascade through here as well. All right. Okay, so groups. All right, there's another one of these guys, right? Humanity, again, very good. Well done, people. Yeah. Okay. So let's think about these, at least these very simple models, and see if we can, again, just move them out a little bit to see if we can get some more intuition about how these things can spread. It's exactly the sort of thing we were talking about before. You want to see how robust your mechanism is. You know, are there more stories adjacent to the one you've found out? So sparse interactions, that's fine. That was a big deal in the original story. Degree distribution is generally a big deal, fair enough, so we should be able to see that. And of course, and we've been able to explore that with random networks, but random networks are not social networks, right? And so group structure is this big piece to add. And you've seen this now several times. I'll show you different kinds of group structure networks. Here's one. So we take a random network or some kind of network and then replace the nodes by groups. And then you can have probably of connecting within, P is across the groups and Q is within. So you maybe pop 10 nodes in here, for example, universally, and then you start wiring them up in certain ways. So this makes an interesting kind of network to explore. It still there's a lot of randomness, but locally it's groups connecting to groups, so there's a different thing. So you can start to think, all right, well, if all of these guys are on for some reason, then they might persuade the group adjacent to them to switch on in a way that would never happen with the original, if this was just a node and this was a node and this was a node. Okay, fair enough. And that's easy to make, so it's not so realistic. You've seen these things before. This is this idea of generalized affiliation models, right? So we have a bunch of individuals. They have some identity. They have attributes, and we connect them as a function of these attributes. So we're going to complicate this a little more. I'm just, you don't have to worry about these things. I'm not going to test you on them. So we have this thing where we create these hierarchical structures for the identity space, if you like, and connect individuals based on their nearness in these different identity dimensions. Okay, and I'll just tell you, we're going to add one more thing, which is once we've made that network, then we're going to add triadic closures, which means that, it very simply means that if you have two friends, there's a chance that they'll get to know each other, right? Okay, so two ways that could happen. One is within a group, so you're already in a group, you share a group together, so there's a chance. That's one probability. This was extremely complicated. Messy code, I have to say. And then across groups, right? So you have friends in two different groups. You know that they're not connected, and you might want to say there's a different probability associated with them.
So you're saying different identities, like, are we talking each person has maybe 3 different identifying features, like
Yeah, right.
age, occupation,
Yes.
okay.
Yeah, right.
And
those
levels that they connect with different people.
Yeah. So the simple model that we've done, of course, this, and I showed some support for it, but you could make a much more realistic one, was to have a hierarchical division for each attribute. So for instance, this, right? This is occupation, kindergarten teacher, so we're down to the specific level, then there are these categorizations and so on. So there's the sense that these two characters have an affinity, they have a lesser affinity with these ones, but fair enough, in this dimension of identity. And then there's where you live, there's how old you are. These are all pieces that could, and we went for this hierarchical breakdown. I mean, you could argue about what geography really is, but it's a messy, complicated thing. Okay, so, all right, so basically we've made some very, one sort of odd group-based network, the random networks turned into group-based networks. And then we made a one that sort of has more of a realistic flavor. But again, still a long way away. Now, I showed you these last time. See if we can remember these guys. So these are, this line across here is for these random group networks, and then this is a generalized affiliation model network. So these are these two ways of making, just two ways of making group-based networks that are semi-realistic. You can take real data. This is before, I guess, we had sort of an onslaught of real data about social phenomena. This is really nice. Okay, so this little red box here is the outside of the cascade window for pure random networks, the original stuff that Duncan did, this PNAS paper in 2002. It's just, that's the cascade window, right? So things can spread in this box. So again, this is threshold, the individual thresholds that people have. Everyone has the same threshold in this game. And this is the average degree of the network. So it's going from 0 to 100. There's this window here that is repeated in all of these cases, and it's just for pure random networks. So if we start with a single seed in these group-based networks, then we get this kind of modified thing, but it's sort of similar size. The cascade window isn't much bigger. If we set, so both of these models have groups of size 10. It's just a parameter, not telling you all the things, okay? So now if we say, all right, let's start off with 10, but we're going to just randomly sprinkle them around, then that gets you a bit of gain, right? So the window opens up. So higher degree networks can have spreading, right? So having higher degree was that thing that thwarted this sort of threshold spreading, right? Because the more friends you have, at least in the random case, the more friends you have, the better you are at saying you see one person do something, the more resilient you are to adopting that, given a particular threshold, right? Because you're taking into account what many, many more people are doing. All right, so it opens up for both of them if you now sprinkle random seeds. But if you actually set off a group, so you just take one group and switch all of them on, and we do this repeatedly, and we do it for all of these different example thresholds and average degrees, then this window opens up hugely, right? So it connects back to that kind of triggering example I was trying to show you, that now the thing is much more, spreading is much more, it's possible for a much wider range of kinds of structures. Random networks out here would never have any spreading, right? These pure random networks. So this is an average degree of 100, right? So 1 in 100. This is something where, I don't know, this is 0.05, so a threshold is now, it means 1 in 20 of your neighbors would have to be on. This is an incredibly resilient network if it's purely random, right? If it's purely random. You have on average 100 friends. No one is getting switched on. But if you take that average of 100 and restructure the thing so that there's groups in there, suddenly that becomes a volatile situation for this threshold one. Right, so whereas before it was obvious, everyone has 100 friends, when we're just sort of looking at the random network, we say, okay, no one is vulnerable. This is not going to spread. Okay, but the connections have changed such that now when a group starts off, there's a good chance that groups nearby can be infected, and then the whole thing spreads and takes off. So the pattern of connections matters enormously, right? There are a couple of other examples that I just wanted to finish off with. And so this is this group-based, this is this multiplier story again. So we take the top 10% and the average individuals, again, the top 10% and the average individuals, and look at the final sizes of or the average size of spreads, right? So 0 to 1, so it's the fraction that gets spread. And then we have these patterns again. So again, that little window there shows you where there's a gain, right? There's a gain. So it's better, you really want to move your money or whatever your influence into the top 10% in that the gain is greater than 1. Okay. But here we get something very odd. We actually get the gain is less than 1. So this is for well-connected networks. Let me try to explain this. This is the degree ratio here, right? So the well-connected ones have, here it's 50% more. This is 1.5. So the top 10% are more connected than the average. And this is the gain, right? This dashed line. And if you take the ratio of those two pieces, you're actually getting less, right? So the sum of that is that the more connected nodes are doing worse, actually, on average. right? So you could take guys with average degree 5, test them, run the thing over and over and over. It leads to some average size of spread. I have one more slide to show you on that. And then you can say, all right, it's great. So you take the degree 10 guys. It turns out that they actually, on average, spreading starting from them is smaller, which is a bit surprising. You would think, so here's a little example where it does what you'd think. I'll just show you this piece here. This is the average cascade size starting from nodes of these degrees. This is the underlying degree distribution in this case. It's a very simple kind of spreading. So the point is that the more connected your initial seed, the bigger the average size, right? This is just as kind of a standard biological spreading here, very simple spreading. So that's intuitively right. Okay, so here's an example. This is one of these group-based ones where here's on average, the cascade size you get out, and it actually has a maximum and drops down. It doesn't increase monotonically. So this is as a function of the initial seed's average degree, not average, the initial seed's degree. And this is the underlying distribution, and this is the mean. So you could say, all right, well, let's influence someone who's got average degree 15. They will actually do worse than someone who's got an average degree of 5. So that's a bit strange, right? And it's because of a sortativity, right? So it's a sortativity. What's happening is we're just starting from one person. You have groups of poorly connected individuals, relatively poorly connected individuals. So one of them starts wearing Uggs and they're like, yay, and they all start. And then as a group, they can influence other groups. But if you try to go to a group where everyone's well connected, and you convert someone, then everyone else is like, no. Okay, so it's because the well-connected people are next to the other well-connected people, and it can't spread into that little local group. Yes? Making money.
No, it's when something awful happens in a huge crowd, and how that spreads to a crowd. Is it more this group, like sort of thing?
You mean like a panic,
Yeah.
that sort of thing, like stampedes and so on?
Yeah, like crowd behavior, which on network, because now you have
So actually, okay, so crowd behavior, because people are pressed in much more, actually much more like a fluid. This is more of we're talking about social networks where people are, are in space, whatever, they're emailing each other. No one emails. They're tweeting, whatever they're doing. Using phones? I don't know. What do you people do? They're talking to each other in some way, right? There's more of a social network, right? Whereas if you're in confined spaces and you have people all pushing on each other, and so there's unfortunately a lot of study of this now. For instance, Mecca. Okay, so there have been a lot of stampedes for religious in India, Mecca as well. People are on a Hajj or whatever. Have ended in disaster, and so in fact, Saudi Arabia set up cameras above these crowds so they could kind of follow and see what's going on. You see little fracture waves occurring that sometimes presage a really bad event, and the result has been maybe I've talked about this. They changed the structure of things, right? Particularly in Mecca, there are 3, as I understand it, 3 pillars that you throw stones at, right? So they actually made them, this is fluids, right? They made them they actually extended them so that it made the crowd walk past them in a particular way. Because before they were just circular. So you'd kind of come in from all directions. So they actually added to them. So that made people go this way. And now there are something like 3 or 4, 5 levels that people can come in, and there are basic sort of essentially walkways that take you up over the top. People have different things. So if you're from a very traditional, you will never take the top ones. You have to walk on the bottom, and other people are fine. They're fine to go over. But it's split up. People come from different directions. So, I mean, I'm just saying that sort of has ended in people figuring out better ways to do it. Of course, more and more people makes it harder. But it does seem to be more like a fluid, and there's a lot of work on pedestrian dynamics and so on. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So there's some nice work. There's Dirk Helbing has done a lot of stuff at ETH Zurich, and it's a big recognition by Saudi Arabia that people have helped in this way. Is that too much? Well, so so crowds are much more, clear kind of lattice structure, like it's a fluids thing, much more, can become more of a fluids thing. This is more about your connections, which, don't have to be in physical space. They can be distributed over time, yeah. And certainly things that are harder to spread, like political beliefs or, things that, say, people don't talk about as much, or shouldn't talk about as much, religious beliefs, they spread in different ways, right? Oh, they can spread in different ways. So that was something I've said before, the actual influence graph changes. There's some social network, but you will never talk to A about something, or you'll always talk to B about something, right? There, depending on the topic, different networks light up, essentially.
How many dimensions are you doing this for? Like, numbers of different attributes that a person can have, and does it change? I'm assuming it would change.
Oh, you mean how many different identity attributes?
Yeah.
I think in this one it's just a couple.
Because if you have like 1,000 different ones,
Yeah.
adjacent to everybody on some.
Correct. So that's a real problem, actually. Yeah. So, I mean, this is one of these things where to go further with this sort of stuff,
Whole 6 degrees of separation.
you need to start really quantifying how people interact, which we are doing more and more. And whatever, Facebook gives you something, or they won't share that with anyone. Twitter gives you something else. But yeah, you need a better. At some point, you have to say, okay, these are fun models, and they help us a lot, and they've given us all these ideas. So now we need to, quantify things some more. But you're right, you wouldn't want to have too many attributes. And so one of the things we've sort of shown is that two is a big transition, right? 1 is not enough. 2 is suddenly. This tiny guy, that's supposed to just indicate what the actual average degree is. So this is the average person here. So the most influential characters are below average, which is kind of cool, right? I mean, that's not obvious. I think this is not obvious. But degree associative is the reason. So you have these poorly connected people connected together. One takes off and they're like, whoop. And that's sort of true of the groups adjacent to them. They can start off, and then eventually you can get to the well-connected ones. So it's a different kind of vulnerability. The vulnerables are actually co-located. And look, here's a summary. I have another set of slides that I'll leave out. But what I'll call influential vulnerables are key to really making something spread, right? You can get a ton of people to come and watch your movie. We do this all the time. We spend a ton of money. There's a lot of advertising. It opens in 4,000 theaters. People go to see it, but it's terrible. And then they tell everyone else it's terrible, and no one comes the next week, right? I mean, you can see these things. And then they don't trust you, and they don't trust the movie industry, right? There's a problem to that. But the things that people genuinely talk about outside, away from each other, away from the influence source, they're the ones that really spread. And so we know that, but we try to force it. Right? Facebook does horrible things. Okay. These are just a number of things that kind of come out of this. So early adopters are vulnerable kind of characters. They're not necessarily big influentials, at least in these threshold models. As you've seen in this last bit, the vulnerable nodes are important, but they're not key to the whole thing, right? It's the network structure that can be, right? So it's the group story could be doing everything for you, and likely is in the real world. Cascade condition is a very nice thing to draw out. If you can get that analytically, it's lovely, right? Here's your network. Here is your, whatever it is, your population on top of it. Here are these attributes of them, and here is the spreading mechanism. And all of those things get put into something, and you have a greater than 1 or something somewhere, and right, so you can measure whether things will spread, right? In general, it's going to be a global one, but it's going to be hard to work out analytically. That's fine. There was this early result that I showed you from random networks that the worst cascades that you can get happen in ones where you think it's not going to happen, right? So it's these robust yet fragile situations. Of course, we've talked about this. This is an old story now that I keep building on. But influentials are things that we talk about after the fact, right? Okay. And this is the upshot, right? If you want things to spread, you want them to spread really deeply. You have to keep doing this, trying to create messages or whatever it is, entities that people will pass on from one to another. and so-called influential vulnerables, right? Simple ideas are a good example. We had the BuzzFeed thing, sort of being the modern sort of incorporation of that idea, manifestation of it. Okay, and the last piece is, you know, how do you get people to spread things, or how does your message do that? I mean, of course, displaying can be passive, right? Clothes, Uggs, you know, you just got them on, and everyone else can enjoy your Uggness. And they can be harder to, other things can be harder, right? That's why we, you know, I voted, the buttons, right? That's it. That's, I mean, how else would you know? Like, that person looks like they voted or not? Like, you can't figure it out, right? They're smiling, they're not, you know. But I voted, boom, you know, you can see it. Whether that stops you or makes you vote or not, you know, might like, oh, there's enough people, you know, I don't know. Right, it's like, it's done, yeah. Okay. And then a much more complicated thing that's only been explored a little bit analytically, which I think remains ridiculous, is that, of course, we've looked at one thing spreading at a time, sort of against the sea of other things spreading. But often they're fighting each other, and there's some, right? You know, there's a real battle going on. So that hasn't been explored very much. There's a few pieces on that. Oh, this is great. Okay, so this is a finish of this. I'll show you a little bit. So this is England, Portugal, Spain, and France. Has anyone seen this? This is from a while back. It was just a little experimental piece. So this is empires changing, right? So that's Spain, Venezuela is just popped off, Uruguay, Argentina. This is 1820, so we're having a bit of a bad time. The Mexican Empire, gone. Colombia. Peru is gone, Ecuador, Bolivia. Okay, so that's going to go on for a little while. Okay, so 1800s, I think, plays out pretty... So this is an interesting thing that happens, is that they get bigger. It doesn't show you how, but you'll see these little bubblings. That means so there's an absorption period. And we do have some representatives from these teams, so they'll be kind of amused by these behaviors. But you know, England is really porking up here. Portugal's doing all right because Portugal has Brazil sitting inside it, right? So, what's that? It's already gone? Yeah. Oh, so Portugal is hanging on. Indonesia and would have Indonesia. France is swelling up, so it looks like they've got to pop at some point, basically, from this visualization. So Brazil went from Portugal, is that right? I think that's just randomness, actually. Yeah. I think generally there's antipathy, right? These people, Guam, yep, the Philippines.
So at some point, the United States is going to chunk out.
So it's 1912, yeah. So it started in 1800.
So that's
Canada will come off, yeah. Ooh, that's really going to hurt, that bit. That's really going to hurt. So that was Egypt, actually. Yeah. You really want to lance that one. So that was Canada and South Africa. Iraq, which, you know, very interesting. I think so. Australia, sort of. Yeah. That was Lebanon. So France is Vietnam. All these things matter, of course. India. Sri Lanka is gone. New Zealand. French India. Cambodia. Okay, now I think. So this is. This is 1966, right? Portugal is just holding it together. But everyone else is now copying. Guinea-Bissau just went, and Portugal. Mozambique. I think it must be Angola, Mozambique. It's got to be physical area. I can't remember. I think it is. So that was pretty intense. A little bit of history. There you go. That's all you need to know about. You know, well, United States, you'd have Hong Kong, and then there's Macau. I think Macau was the last one. Is that right? I think that's right. Yeah. Cool. Okay. that's just kind of spreading, but not spreading. Yeah. I mean, it really, there's a lot of models, of course, in physical systems of agglomeration and splitting, right? So that they give power laws, of course.
So for those,
Sorry,
there was like
was just what was it? What was it? Sorry.
talked before about how we're not really looking at multiple phenomena happening.
Oh, right. Yeah. Well, sort of, it's one thing against the background of everything else.
What about the threshold?
Sure.
We have a set threshold in this network, and it works that way. But what
It would change. It would definitely change, and in some of the early Granovetter papers, they totally looked at that. You could absolutely do it. So the question becomes, are there any more simple models to kind of explore that will be helpful? And I think so. But also, we could like that. Because we're in a time where we can quantify so much, it feels like you have to do that. It's painful because because that's hard work as well, right? I mean, it's the right thing to do, but it's just sort of, no, you could definitely do that. I mean, I remember talking about that, exactly that the thresholds would change as a function of its popularity, right? I mean, so everyone's doing it, so you're responding in some way to that as well, which makes it more dynamic and complicated. Okay, so that was exciting. I mean, obviously not super fun for everyone involved, but to say the least, but a big deal. All right, people. So while you are simultaneously thinking about this, I'm going to talk about voting, which has to do with all of this business as well. All right. So, and it's about success. So we've had some, we've talked about spreading. So this connects into that as well. This is why things take off in a more general kind of sense. So people have thought about where superstars come from, right, in different ways, and economists have thought about it in particular. Going back some time, this is 30 years ago, and as with all of these papers, you can look at them if you like. So the economics of superstars. So a typical kind of economics approach. Here's the first observation as given in this paper. Full-time comedians in the world at this point, 200. Soloists in classical music, just a very few. I mean, it's still the same, like people who get paid to be golfers, who get paid to be full-time authors. They're a pretty small subset, right? Of course, they mention economic textbooks because they couldn't help themselves. But again, we get these highly skewed distributions in terms of success, right? And so if we're economists, we think, well, that's a revealing of the quality, right? So you could say that the ordering that you end up with in life is a reflection of the underlying quality of the people who are becoming successful, okay? So let's say that happens, and it's that the reward is convex, right? So this is typical, right? The second derivative is greater than 0. And there are a couple of reasons for why that might be. So why does, say, underlying quality, whatever that means, quality to reward, that could map linearly. If we're in some sort of socialist situation, it maps like this, right? In principle, but it doesn't really. There's a little bit of, like some kind of weird bubblings going on, right? It could be that. But the idea is it's this, right? And so why is that? Well, here's an example. So a very good surgeon is, more than twice as good as two that are half as good, right? So in some sense, right? So that you don't want a couple of mediocre, you could have 10 mediocre surgeons around you. You'd rather have one that is extremely good. So the money goes to those people who are thought to be better. And technology, right? So that you can't reproduce your surgeon so well, but you can reproduce your music or your books, whatever it is. Those things you can augment someone tremendously. Now, right? It used to be that you would have to go and listen to someone sing. You just would have to go, right? We didn't record. The first recordings of anyone speaking that still exist, 18, what is it? It's after photographs, I think. Yeah, right. I mean, it's not very long ago, to be honest, right? We'd invented a lot of other stuff by then, but yeah, there you go, yeah. And recording it really well took, that took, of course, longer and so on. Okay, but that ability is a big deal. So it's this idea of joint consumption that people can, right? They're not excluding each other. Public good, of course, you're all eating the same paddock or whatever it is. Here you can replicate the paddock. That is what we call fields, where I come from. Yeah, right.
Only a couple people can appreciate a really good surgeon because they only ever see a certain number of people.
Mm-hmm.
But all of the U.S. listens to just Bieber.
He said incriminatingly. Yeah, sure, they're different things. Yeah. Oh, absolutely, right. And the scope of them, will change. But the suggestion, at least I'm just telling you what this goes. The suggestion is that there's this, right, that the fact that this is greater than 0 is because you can't, the way substitution could work. And as we've talked about, art and music and cultural goods, it's a bit tricky to figure out why something is much. And the triptych that just sold for $140 million, it's the most expensive piece of art ever. I mean, it's a triptych, 3 pieces. I don't know. I can't. And there was a Warhol that just sold for over $100 million. I mean, it's a lot of money to be. There's $100 million here and a painting, and you swap them. And that seems sort of, right? A lot of people believe in that $100 million as cash, right? Which is all made up too, but we believe in that one much more strongly, right? You can go and buy bananas with $10 or whatever. You can take that, but you can't. It's hard to deal with that. The painting is it's a funny thing to put to put your belief into, but that's a swap. And it's belief about the future and all sorts of things. But okay, so here's an opposite kind of aspect, which is so this is a few years later. Imagine this is Adler imagining, well, what happens if everyone's quality is the same, right, to start with? What can you get an uneven distribution out of that? And that's a interesting kind of aspect that we'll dig into with an experiment that I want to talk to you about. So right, we're people. So we want to coordinate in various ways. We like to do that. You can argue for all sorts of reasons as why that happens. But we want to be on the same team. So that our team beats their team, all sorts of things, right? So there's that. There's just people sort of synchronizing, and that can lead to differential success, right? So that Bieber is a huge thing because it's fun to talk about Bieber, but he sort of could have been replaceable by someone else. But so that in that sense, it's purely a social construction. It's completely made up in our heads, which fits with a lot of our views of, perhaps, of your views of modern art, right? And how do you measure inherent quality? I mean, is that even a measurable piece? I mean, it's unavoidable. You want to talk about it. I mean, people have, you look at sport. I mean, we just had this example for NFL, right? I mean, what is the inherent quality, right? There are various measures of those players that are made in all the games they play, and then there are various strength tests and so on. So they're numbers, and you can see if they transform into success later on. All right, so we know that, yes, there's going to be some role of some inherent, some whatever weird inherent quality, and then some, how am I going to do with this? And then some measure of some luck and chance and so on, right? So let's see if we can figure those things out. And again, it will play into these skewed distributions. All right, so there's some funny things that happen with all sorts of, with voting systems. I'll mention a few different kinds, because essentially this is kind of a voting problem, right? You vote, every time someone listens to Bieber, they're voting, right? Unless they're kind of, or buys his album, they're voting. So this is, it's hard to figure out all the details here, but there's a website called jike.com, may not exist anymore. But they're very easy decisions. It's about opinions, right? Someone puts up a question, and then people basically can just put yes or no, right? Anonymously, so it's really quick. That tends to lead to bandwagoning if you look at how those things go. And there's more work recently that shows that, and I mentioned this, I think, that positive statements made early on tend to be reinforced. Negative ones tend to be kind of sorted out, actually, if they're in some sense false, right? So made up negative things tend to be sorted out. Obviously it depends on the crowd. So self-selection is a bit of a problem. So you can imagine that that's what's going on here. So Amazon, you get all these positive votes early on, these positive statements, people are then motivated perhaps to, if they don't like the thing, to say, it's no, by the way, this is my terrible experience, right? Amazon people, you're required to write some amount, so people tend to put, you'd see it now and then, people will say, I am just typing to fill up my character limit. You don't see that too much. People usually, actually write something on Amazon. So there's a sense that these are costs, there's more costs, right, in putting up your vote here. And that tends maybe to draw out people who will say opposite things. So really positive stuff tends to revert to a mean. This one has more bandwagoning. So there's, that's an interesting possibility that this is more generally true. I don't know. Oh yeah. Thanks, sorry. Thank you. Let's do it again, people.
On that website,
Look at these things. Yep.
where I was trying to buy the thing from, I had no way of knowing what the reviews were and how well the product was doing, but I knew I could find good reviews on Amazon, complete reviews.
Mm-hmm.
So you go to Amazon for all your reviews.
And you buy it somewhere else, you mean?
Yeah, instead of like finding it on the website. So
Yeah.
now I'm wondering about how do you influence vote influence sales?
You mean in a bad way? How do you get people to talk about it, to actually enter? Oh, that's a really hard problem. Yeah. And some of the big sites. Oh, so Amazon, I mean, they've worked hard for a long time to make themselves they named themselves Amazon for a very cute, they wanted to be the biggest thing there is. That's where the name comes from. It's because it's not just going to be about books, we're going to run the whole thing. So, we'll see how they go, but they continue to do that, and their big thing is trust, actually. One of their biggest things is trust. Like they're good at making sure the thing works. They don't do everything at all. They do a lot of things, but that was something that took a long time to just, make robust. I think those specialty places, it's more like forums probably, that people, where they talk about whatever it is, piano tuning or fish keeping, like people will go there and spend a lot of time there and in essence write reviews, but it's not worth your while to be like a little voice when there are 3 other voices, like that just, but unless you kind of really, you really love writing stuff, so you're going to be, I'm going to say something here on this side about this thing because I either really like it or I really don't. That's very hard to tease out. I mean, what I just said, I don't know if that's true, but moderate voices, it's like, okay. People, they send emails to try and get you involved, like, I'll give you a rebate if you write something, but that's, ultimately not great, right? Something like Amazon now has such a big structure that it's actually kind of a good thing to contribute to. It will probably last, and it's not a complete waste of your time, and yeah. Okay, a couple of other things. This is a very interesting paper from a few years ago now, and it's about voting, and it's quite mathematical actually, but the overall idea is that just scoring individuals seems to work better than, it removes a lot of the problems that you have with rank-based, where you say, say voting, right? Here's my candidate 1, here's number 2, here's number 3. And then someone else can say 1, 2, 3, or 1, 3, 2, right? They order them in different ways. There's a famous paradox, arrow paradox, which is that you can end up with A being preferred to B, being preferred to C, being preferred to A in certain, somewhat unusual circumstances, but it can happen. Whereas if you, say you've got 3 candidates and you give them 0 out of 10s, or give them 1 to 5 stars. Everyone's used to Amazon and Netflix and so on. Everyone in the world, but a lot of people are used to that kind of scale on the web. So, let them do that. So you can impart more information. Like you might want to give both presidential candidates a 0, or you might want to give 1 over here and a 2 over here out of 10. Like both, right? Or you might want to give a 10 and a 0. Whatever it is. But you're actually being the information you can deliver is reduced, which is a very interesting issue about voting, democracy, and so on. Right? Oh yeah,
on
how they behaved.
how they will rank things. So some people will give like really high scores, and some people
Oh, and then, so they know how to kind of,
how to rate them.
yeah. So someone is not worth their, it's not their opinion gets a little downgraded. If they hate everything or they love everything, then
Well, it's just
they're not discriminating. Yeah. We can look at whether they, they vote for the things that succeed as well. All sorts of stuff. Yeah. Oh, runoff voting? Instant runoff? Well, Australia. That's in Australia. It's huge in Australia, and it's totally.
everybody was, nobody knew it was on the ballot until like
It's a, but the thing is, it's also hard. It's harder to grasp, and you can have things that feel a little funny.
Everybody that was making that argument understood it. They were just saying it was harder for other people to grasp.
Right, but you can see why. No. You can see why. I mean, it was impressive to get it in, but you could see why there'd be a barrier to get it in the first place.
Right.
And if something goes wrong, you could see why a whole team could rise up and say, no, like this is bad. But it is good, by and large. We actually used it in our elections for like college president, all sorts of, which means the students, right? College is where the students live. So, and I remember we had the countback thing. So if you end up with the same number of votes, you do the countback. So we had one case where it was equal when you went back and equal and equal. So they ended up, which is very unusual. We had a joint pair running the thing. Because usually that doesn't happen, right? But it actually worked out that, yeah. I don't know what the chances were. It's pretty small. Well, let me, wow. Yeah, I know. All right, so, okay. So this is a paper from 2004. Again, it's a modeling thing, but they did a very nice job. So you've got n objects, which do have some underlying quality Q, which is distributed in some way. Really just an ordering, perhaps, but you get some variable. Okay, so it's distributed in some way, and that would play into it. And then people are allowed to, it's a model. People, in a sense, are allowed to choose the objects to vote on or to compare based on how many votes they already have. So this is a sensible thing, right? So we're always ranking things, and you see the top 10 or you see whatever, so people see those things, right? But imagine it's something that's a little more distributed. There's just sort of a top 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's what everyone else has done before. You look at what people have voted for, so you go, all right, I'm going to look at the top ones. You can't help yourself. And they did a couple of things. One was, some power alpha here, and then the same thing, but also then multiplying by this underlying quality. Right? And it was comparative ranking, actually, I believe. Okay, so if alpha is less than 1, so this is a sublinear sort of story, then you get the correct ordering, because the things down the bottom aren't getting buried. But if it's superlinear, then it's never sorted out. So if you have a mechanism that is, as people are voting, it's ongoing, they're presenting, it's becoming more and more clear the things that are in front. I mean, this should make sense. It fits with some of the stuff we've done. This sort of matches up with the rich gets richer story. Then it's never sorted out. You never retrieve that underlying quality. It's related to Adler stuff and the stuff I'll show you, I guess, on Thursday. But let me get to that. I'll get to the experiment. I want to set up a little more beforehand. So this is a crazy experiment. It's, I believe it's true of chickens, that if they can set up pecking order. They do. I mean, this is where pecking orders come from. They set up a pecking order. You can isolate them and then bring them back, and you can get different arrangements, right, occurring. I'm not sure if you reran middle school over and over, if that would happen, how much, but I suspect it would because of the experiment that I'll show you. This is an experiment. It's like pecking, but it's for fish. These fish tend to have a go at each other. It's a paper that was in PNAS 11 years ago. And here's the story, right? So you have a graduate student who has to watch fish tanks, in this case. They've done all sorts of things, these graduate students. So these ones had to watch fish tanks and then figure out who was pecking who and who was dominating, right? So you've got 4 fish in each tank. They're supposed to be a similar size, so it's sort of a fair game to start with. And this is a case where A, B, C, D, this is the ordering that arose. And then they're separated for some period of time and put back in a tank. And this is the ordering that ends up at, so there's in 6, how many were, 22, there are 22 observations. So 6 of them came back the same, right? They ran it again, the fish sorted themselves out in the same way. But you got these sorts of things. So there's one case where A became the epsilon fish, or a delta fish, I suppose, and then the D fish became the alpha. There were complicated initial states that ended up being sorted out in different ways, complicated final states. Again, here's D going up for the win. And A really losing out. So these are, there are two of these little, that are the numbers at the bottom. But 3/4 of the time, the hierarchy changed. So that's pretty, pretty weird. These are some other details here, but we'll finish. So I'm going to tell you about this on Thursday, as it turns out. And I don't have to talk too much about it, but I'll tell you a bit about this. We'll talk a little bit about scaling. But this is basically the fish experiment with humans in a particular way. All right, good. So if we've done all those things, I'll give you your rewards on Thursday.